8 years ago, Michael Carter stood beside a polished wooden coffin and watched the last person who truly knew his childhood disappear beneath the soil. The sky that afternoon hung low and gray above the cemetery, the kind of sky that made even strangers speak in hushed voices. Michael barely heard the pastor's words as the wind moved through the trees. His mother, Eleanor Carter, had always been a strong presence in his life, the woman who raised him in a modest home on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Yet that day the funeral was strangely small. A few distant relatives stood quietly, the coffin remained sealed, and the service ended faster than Michael expected. The officials said Eleanor had died suddenly in her sleep from heart failure. The doctors signed the papers, the funeral director handled the arrangements, and the case was closed before Michael could process the loss. Life moved forward, or at least that was the appearance he gave the world. Over the next several years, Michael Carter transformed himself from a struggling entrepreneur into a powerful billionaire known across the United States for his investments in technology and real estate. His companies expanded rapidly, his name appeared in financial magazines, and the boy who once worried about paying the electric bill now owned luxury penthouses and private jets. Yet there was one place he refused to return to. The old house where he grew up sat quietly at the end of Maple Ridge Road, a narrow street lined with aging trees and worn sidewalks. After Eleanor's funeral, Michael locked the front door and walked away from that house, promising himself he would never step inside again. Too many memories lived within those walls. Memories of long nights studying at the kitchen table, memories of arguments and difficult conversations, memories of a childhood shaped by a mother who loved him fiercely but often controlled every decision he made. For 8 years the house remained empty, its white paint slowly fading under the sun, its wooden fence bending with time. Neighbors rarely walked past the property anymore. Weeds pushed through the driveway, and the windows collected dust that thickened year after year. Some people in the neighborhood whispered that the Carter house carried a strange silence, as though the past had settled into its rooms and refused to leave. Michael had no reason to care. His life now existed in skyscrapers and boardrooms, far from the quiet street where he once played basketball in the driveway as a boy. But life has a way of pulling people back to places they thought they had left forever. Late one autumn evening, Michael's black car turned onto Maple Ridge Road for the first time in nearly a decade. The reason for his return was simple on paper. A development company wanted to purchase the property and build a row of luxury townhouses. The deal would take only a signature, yet Michael insisted on seeing the house one last time before it was sold. As the car slowed near the end of the street, the headlights swept across the familiar outline of the old Carter home. The porch light had long since burned out. The front yard looked larger than Michael remembered, though most of it had been claimed by tall grass and wild vines climbing the fence. When he stepped out of the car, the night air felt colder than expected, and the quiet of the street pressed against his ears. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the house where he had spent his entire childhood. 8 years had passed since he last touched that door handle. 8 years since he walked through those rooms carrying the weight of grief and unfinished conversations. He told himself this visit would be quick. Unlock the door, confirm the property condition, sign the papers the following week, and leave the past exactly where it belonged. But as he walked up the cracked pathway toward the porch, something inside him shifted in a way he could not explain. The wooden steps creaked beneath his shoes, echoing softly in the stillness of the neighborhood. Michael pulled the old key from his coat pocket, the same brass key he had carried since childhood, and slid it into the lock. The door resisted at first, as if the house itself had forgotten how to open. Then it slowly gave way, releasing a faint breath of air that smelled of dust, wood, and distant memories. The hallway inside was darker than he expected, the shadows stretching along the walls where family photos once hung. Michael stepped across the threshold, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the cracked curtains. For a few seconds, nothing moved. The house appeared exactly as he had left it years ago, silent and still, like a place preserved in time. Yet something about the air felt different. Michael could not explain the feeling, only that it caused his heartbeat to slow and his thoughts to sharpen. He took another step forward, the floorboards responding with a quiet groan beneath his weight. That was when he saw her. At the far end of the hallway, standing where the staircase met the living room, A woman stood motionless in the dim light. Her posture was familiar, the shape of her face unmistakable even after all these years. Michael felt the breath leave his chest as if someone had struck him without warning. Because the woman standing in that hallway was Eleanor Carter, the same woman he had buried 8 years earlier. The same woman whose coffin he had watched disappear into the ground on a gray afternoon surrounded by strangers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Michael stared across the room, his mind racing through every possible explanation, every memory of the funeral, every document confirming her death. Yet the woman remained there, calm and real, her eyes fixed on him with the quiet recognition of someone who had expected this moment for a long time. And then Michael noticed something else. Just behind her, partially hidden by the shadow of the staircase, stood a young girl holding the edge of the railing. Her small figure shifted slightly as she stepped forward into the light. Michael's heart pounded harder than it had in years, because he recognized that face instantly. The girl standing beside Eleanor Carter was his daughter, Emily, the child who had disappeared 3 years earlier without leaving a single clue behind. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. How could a woman declared dead nearly a decade earlier suddenly be standing in the hallway of a house everyone believed had been empty for years? That question alone was enough to shake the foundation of everything Michael Carter thought he understood about his past. Yet the deeper shock came from the small figure standing beside Eleanor Carter. The girl holding the staircase railing was Emily Carter, Michael's daughter, the same child who had disappeared 3 years earlier without a trace. For 3 long years, investigators searched for answers. Flyers covered telephone poles across several states. Detectives followed every lead they could find, and Michael spent a fortune hiring private investigators to continue the search long after the official case had slowed down. Every report ended the same way, with no clear evidence and no explanation for where Emily had gone. Now, suddenly, she was here, standing quietly beside the woman Michael had buried 8 years ago. Nothing about that moment made sense. Michael's mind raced back to the funeral, to the paperwork, to the sealed coffin that had been lowered into the ground while a handful of people watched in silence. Doctors confirmed Eleanor Carter's death. A funeral home prepared the body. Legal documents transferred property and accounts. Everything had followed the proper procedures, at least on the surface. And yet the evidence standing in front of him suggested something very different had happened all those years ago. As investigators would later discover, the Carter family history contained more unanswered questions than anyone had realized. When detectives reopened the records surrounding Eleanor Carter's reported death, small details began to stand out in ways they had not before. The death certificate had been signed quickly by a physician who no longer worked in the county. The funeral arrangements had been handled privately by a lawyer Eleanor trusted for decades. And the coffin itself had remained closed during the service, something explained at the time as a simple request for privacy. None of these details appeared suspicious on their own, yet together they formed a quiet pattern that investigators could not ignore. The more they reviewed the timeline of Eleanor's final weeks, the more gaps appeared between official records and the memories of neighbors who once knew the Carter family well. Some recalled seeing Eleanor walking through the neighborhood just days before the funeral, moving slowly but showing no obvious signs of illness. Others remembered a moving truck parked outside the Carter house late one night shortly before her reported death. At the time, those details meant very little. Years later, they began to take on a different meaning. At the same time, the mystery of Emily Carter's disappearance returned to the center of the investigation. When Emily vanished 3 years earlier, the case had confused local authorities from the very beginning. There were no signs of forced entry in Michael's home, no ransom demands, and no witnesses who could explain how an 8-year-old girl simply vanished from a secure property in the middle of the night. Security cameras around the neighborhood showed no unfamiliar vehicles entering or leaving the street. Emily's bedroom window had been closed, her backpack still resting beside her desk, and her favorite stuffed bear remained tucked beneath the blanket exactly where she left it before going to sleep. Detectives questioned friends, teachers, neighbors, and family members. Each interview ended with the same conclusion: no one had seen anything unusual. Michael Carter's public profile only made the situation more intense. News stations across the country reported the story for weeks, showing Emily's photograph beside headlines asking where the billionaire's daughter had gone. Despite the attention and the resources spent searching, the case slowly faded from national coverage when no evidence appeared. Now those two mysteries, separated by years, seemed to collide inside the quiet walls of the Carter house. A mother who had supposedly died 8 years earlier was standing alive in the hallway. A daughter who had vanished without explanation was standing beside her. The connection between those events raised questions that stretched far beyond the property on Maple Ridge Road. Investigators who would later examine the Carter family's past began to describe the situation as one of the strangest cases they had encountered in years. Because every new discovery pointed back to a simple but unsettling possibility, that the story of Eleanor Carter's death had never been true in the first place. And if that was the case, it meant someone had carefully constructed a version of events designed to convince everyone that Eleanor Carter was gone forever. It also meant the disappearance of Emily Carter might not have been the random mystery it once appeared to be. Somewhere inside the quiet history of the Carter family, the truth had been waiting, hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. As investigators would soon learn, the more they examined the past, the more disturbing the answers became. Long before the headlines, the boardrooms, and the fortune that eventually placed his name among the wealthiest entrepreneurs in America, Michael Carter was simply a boy growing up in a quiet town in Ohio. The neighborhood where he spent his childhood was modest and ordinary, a place where neighbors waved to each other across small lawns and children rode bicycles down streets that rarely saw heavy traffic. The Carter house sat at the far end of Maple Ridge Road, a narrow street shaded by tall trees that had been standing there for decades. It was not a large house, but to Michael it was the center of everything he knew. Inside those walls he learned how to read, how to fix small things around the house, and how to work hard even when life felt unfair. His mother, Eleanor Carter, believed strongly in discipline and self-reliance. She often reminded Michael that the world outside their town would not be easy for him, and she pushed him constantly to think beyond the limits of their small community. Money was always tight in the Carter household. Eleanor worked long hours in administrative offices and local accounting firms, taking whatever stable job she could find while raising her son alone. Michael never knew his father, and Eleanor rarely spoke about the past. When he asked questions about family history, she usually answered in short sentences before changing the subject entirely. Over time, Michael stopped asking. Instead, he focused on school, on small jobs around the neighborhood, and on helping his mother keep their household running. During the summers, he mowed lawns, carried lumber at a local construction yard, and saved every dollar he could earn. Those early years shaped his understanding of work and ambition. By the time he reached his late teens, Michael had already developed a reputation among neighbors as a determined young man who refused to settle for the limitations around him. Eleanor Carter watched all of this carefully. To the outside world, she appeared to be the definition of a devoted parent. She attended school meetings, made sure Michael completed his assignments, and encouraged him to pursue opportunities that might eventually lead him beyond their town. Teachers described her as attentive and intelligent, a woman who seemed deeply invested in her son's future. Yet those who spent enough time around the Carter household noticed something else about Eleanor. Her guidance often carried a level of control that went far beyond simple parenting. She kept careful track of Michael's schedule, his friendships, and the decisions he made about his future. When he talked about leaving Ohio after graduation, she asked detailed questions about where he planned to go and who he planned to trust. If a friend suggested an idea she did not approve of, she found quiet ways to discourage the connection. As Michael entered adulthood, his ambitions grew larger than the town that raised him. After finishing school, he moved from one small job to another, working construction during the day while studying business strategies and financial markets at night. He saved money, launched small projects that sometimes failed, and slowly built the experience that would later shape his career. Those early attempts were rarely glamorous. Some ventures collapsed within months. Others survived long enough to teach him lessons about negotiation, risk, and persistence. Yet through each failure, Michael developed a stronger understanding of how businesses operated. By the time he reached his early 30s, his determination began to pay off. Strategic investments in emerging technology companies and real estate developments transformed his finances in ways he could not have imagined during his childhood on Maple Ridge Road. Within a few short years, Michael Carter's name began appearing in financial publications across the country. Analysts praised his instincts, investors sought his advice, and his companies expanded rapidly into new markets. From the outside, it appeared as though he had built a perfect life through discipline and intelligence. Yet even as his wealth grew, the influence of Eleanor Carter never fully disappeared. She continued to offer opinions about his choices, sometimes praising his success, but often reminding him that power could attract the wrong kind of attention. Friends who met her later in Michael's life described her as polite but intensely observant, a woman who listened more than she spoke. And while most people viewed her as a proud mother watching her son achieve extraordinary success, those who knew the Carter family closely often noticed something deeper within her behavior. Eleanor Carter did not simply support her son's life. She monitored it, guided it, and in many ways shaped the boundaries around it. To outsiders, she remained the image of loyalty and devotion. But those closest to the family understood that Eleanor Carter rarely allowed anything important to happen without her knowledge or her approval. By the time Michael Carter reached the height of his success, his life had changed in ways that the younger version of himself on Maple Ridge Road could hardly have imagined. The long years of uncertainty and financial struggle were replaced with a level of stability that allowed him to give his family opportunities he never had growing up. Yet despite the wealth and the demanding responsibilities that came with running multiple companies, Michael's priorities had quietly shifted towards something far more personal. At the center of his world was his daughter, Emily Carter. Emily was 8 years old, bright, curious, and full of the kind of energy that made every room feel warmer the moment she entered it. To Michael, she represented something far more meaningful than success or recognition. She was the reminder that life could still carry joy even after loss had reshaped his family. Emily had grown up surrounded by a very different environment from the one Michael remembered from his childhood. While he once worried about saving enough money for school supplies, Emily attended a private elementary school where teachers encouraged creativity and exploration. Her weekends were filled with simple moments that Michael protected carefully despite his busy schedule. Sometimes they spent hours in the backyard tossing a small rubber ball back and forth while she told him stories about her classmates. Other evenings were quieter, with Emily sitting beside him on the living room couch as they watched old movies or worked through homework assignments together. Birthdays became small celebrations that Michael refused to treat as formal events. Instead of extravagant parties, he preferred gathering a few close friends and family members for evenings filled with laughter and cake, where Emily's excitement filled the house with a kind of warmth that reminded him of the childhood he once wished had been simpler. For Michael, these moments carried an importance that few people outside the family fully understood. Several years earlier, tragedy had already visited his life in a way that permanently changed the shape of his family. Emily's mother, Sarah Carter, passed away after a sudden illness when Emily was still very young. The loss left Michael raising his daughter alone while continuing to build the companies that depended on his leadership. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but it also strengthened the bond he shared with Emily. In many ways, father and daughter became each other's source of comfort. Michael did everything he could to make sure Emily felt safe and supported. He attended school events whenever possible, read bedtime stories even after long business trips, and made certain she understood that she would never face the world alone. Yet within the Carter family, another presence continued to influence their lives in subtle but powerful ways. Eleanor Carter remained close to her son and granddaughter, offering help with childcare and spending long afternoons at Michael's home while he traveled for work. To outsiders, Eleanor appeared to be the ideal grandmother. She attended Emily's school plays, baked cookies during the holidays, and spoke proudly about her granddaughter's intelligence whenever neighbors asked about the family. Emily seemed to enjoy those visits as well. She often sat beside Eleanor at the kitchen table listening to stories about the old days in Ohio, asking questions about Michael's childhood, and laughing when Eleanor described the mischievous things he did as a boy. But as time passed, small signs began to suggest that Eleanor's involvement in Emily's life extended beyond ordinary affection. Michael noticed that his mother often expressed strong opinions about how Emily should be raised, particularly when it came to decisions about school activities, friendships, and the amount of time Emily spent surrounded by the luxury that came with Michael's wealth. Eleanor believed that too much comfort could weaken a child's character. She reminded Michael repeatedly that the world was filled with people who valued money over family, and she worried that Emily might grow up disconnected from the values she considered important. At first, Michael dismissed those concerns as the natural caution of a grandmother who had spent most of her life living modestly. Yet the more time Eleanor spent around Emily, the more her influence seemed to grow. Friends of the family later recalled moments when Eleanor quietly stepped into decisions that Michael thought he had already settled. She encouraged Emily to question certain rules, offered advice about what kind of people could be trusted, and sometimes suggested that wealth created dangers that children should be protected from. None of those conversations appeared alarming on their own, but together they began shaping the environment around Emily in ways Michael did not fully recognize at the time. To him, his mother was simply continuing the same protective role she had played throughout his life. He believed she loved Emily deeply and wanted what was best for her. What Michael did not realize then was that Eleanor Carter viewed her granddaughter's future through a perspective shaped by years of careful observation and personal conviction. And as events would eventually reveal, Eleanor had already begun imagining a future for Emily that looked very different from the one Michael believed he was building. 8 years before the night Michael Carter opened the door of the abandoned house on Maple Ridge Road, the story of Eleanor Carter's life appeared to come to a quiet and ordinary end. At the time, Michael was in the middle of expanding several major business ventures, traveling frequently between cities and spending long hours negotiating deals that would later become the foundation of his fortune. During that period, Eleanor had been living alone in the old Carter house, keeping her routines simple and familiar. Neighbors occasionally saw her tending the small garden behind the house or walking slowly along the sidewalk in the evenings. She spoke politely to those who greeted her, but rarely stayed outside long. According to the official report filed later that week, Eleanor Carter passed away suddenly in her sleep after suffering heart failure. The news reached Michael through a phone call early in the morning while he was attending meetings out of state. By the time he returned to Ohio, arrangements for the funeral had already been set in motion. The service itself was quiet and brief. A small group gathered at the cemetery outside town, including a few distant relatives, 2 former co-workers of Eleanor, and Michael standing beside the pastor as the ceremony began. The coffin placed before them remained sealed, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky above the burial site. The funeral director explained that Eleanor had requested a closed casket service, something he said was common when families preferred privacy during difficult moments. Michael accepted the explanation without argument. Grief had arrived quickly and without warning, leaving him with little energy to question the details surrounding his mother's death. The pastor delivered a short message about family and memory, and within less than an hour the ceremony was over. The coffin was lowered into the ground while a few quiet words of sympathy passed between those who attended. When it was finished, Michael stood alone for several minutes staring at the fresh soil, trying to process the idea that the woman who raised him was suddenly gone. Looking back years later, Michael would struggle to explain why certain parts of that day felt unusual even then. At the time, those thoughts drifted through his mind only briefly before being pushed aside by the weight of grief and responsibility. One detail that later stood out was the absence of a medical examination beyond the initial declaration of heart failure. No autopsy had been performed to confirm the cause of death. When Michael asked casually about the paperwork, he was told that Eleanor's passing had been considered natural and therefore did not require further investigation. Another detail involved the legal arrangements surrounding her estate. Eleanor's longtime attorney, Robert Langford, handled nearly every step of the process, from the funeral coordination to the transfer of certain documents connected to her personal accounts. Langford had worked with Eleanor for many years and assured Michael that everything had been arranged according to her wishes. At the time, Michael trusted that explanation. His attention was divided between the responsibilities of running his companies and the emotional weight of losing the only parent he had ever known. The idea that something unusual might have happened during those final days never fully formed in his mind. He accepted the documents placed before him, thanked those who attended the funeral, and returned to the fast-moving world of business that demanded his focus. Within weeks, the Carter house on Maple Ridge Road was locked and left empty, its quiet rooms holding memories that Michael preferred not to revisit. From the outside, the story appeared simple and final. Eleanor Carter had died unexpectedly. Her son had mourned her, and life continued forward as it always does after loss. Yet hidden within the small details surrounding that funeral were questions that no one had paused long enough to ask. Questions about the closed coffin, the absence of medical confirmation, and the careful way certain arrangements had been handled without drawing attention. At the time, those details seemed unimportant, almost invisible against the backdrop of grief. Only years later, when Michael Carter stood once again inside the house he had abandoned, would those forgotten moments begin to take on a meaning that no one could have imagined. Several years passed after the funeral of Eleanor Carter, and during that time Michael Carter's life appeared to settle into a rhythm shaped by success and responsibility. His companies expanded into new markets, his name appeared regularly in financial publications, and his schedule filled with meetings that carried him from city to city across the country. Yet through all of it, the most important part of his life remained unchanged. Emily Carter continued to grow into a bright and curious young girl whose laughter filled the rooms of their home with a kind of warmth that no business achievement could replace. Michael structured his demanding schedule around the moments he spent with her, making sure he attended school events whenever possible and protecting quiet evenings together when the noise of his professional life faded into the background. Friends often remarked that despite the pressure of managing a growing empire, Michael seemed most comfortable when he was simply being Emily's father. Then one night, everything changed. It happened quietly, in the ordinary hours when most families expect the world to remain safe and predictable. Michael had returned home late after a long day of meetings and checked briefly on Emily before going to bed. She was asleep in her room, her favorite stuffed bear resting beside her pillow exactly where she always kept it. Nothing about the house felt unusual. The doors were locked, the security system remained active, and the neighborhood outside was as calm as it had always been. But sometime before the morning light reached the windows, Emily Carter disappeared. When Michael opened her bedroom door the following day, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The bed was empty, the blanket slightly folded as though she had climbed out quietly during the night. One of the windows stood partially open, allowing the early morning air to move slowly through the curtains. For a few seconds, Michael believed Emily had simply wandered into another room, perhaps waking early and deciding to watch television downstairs. He called her name once, then again louder as he moved through the hallway. Each room answered with the same quiet stillness. Within minutes, that quiet turned into panic. Michael searched every corner of the house, checking closets, bathrooms, the backyard, even the garage. Emily was nowhere to be found. The security company was contacted immediately, and police officers arrived soon afterward to begin what would become one of the most confusing investigations the local department had faced in years. Detectives examined the bedroom carefully, documenting every detail that might offer a clue about what happened during the night. They noted the open window, the untouched backpack beside Emily's desk, and the stuffed bear still resting on the bed. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. The locks remained intact, the security alarms had not been triggered, and the cameras positioned around the property showed no unfamiliar vehicles arriving or leaving during the hours when Emily vanished. News of the disappearance spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside Michael Carter's home within hours, broadcasting updates that carried Emily's photograph across television screens throughout the country. Her smiling face appeared beside headlines asking where the billionaire's daughter had gone. Law enforcement agencies coordinated search efforts across several counties, organizing volunteers to comb through nearby forests, parks, and abandoned buildings. Helicopters scanned the surrounding areas from the air, while trained dogs followed possible scent trails through the neighborhood. Every effort was made to locate even the smallest piece of evidence that might explain how an 8-year-old girl could disappear without leaving a trace. Yet despite the scale of the search, no clear answers emerged. There was no ransom demand, no suspicious communication, and no witness who could confirm seeing Emily during the hours when she vanished. Friends, teachers, and neighbors were interviewed repeatedly, each conversation producing the same result. Everyone described Emily as a happy child who showed no signs of planning to run away or leaving with someone she barely knew. Detectives explored every possible lead, from potential kidnappings to family disputes, but none of those paths led to a convincing explanation. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation slowly lost momentum as new cases demanded the attention of local authorities. For Michael Carter, those 3 years became a relentless search defined by hope and exhaustion. He hired private investigators to continue examining the evidence long after the official investigation slowed down. Specialists reviewed security footage frame by frame. Analysts studied phone records and financial transactions, and search teams revisited locations that had already been examined multiple times. Michael traveled across several states following any rumor that suggested Emily might have been seen somewhere. Each lead brought a brief moment of possibility before ending the same way the others had ended. No confirmation, no clear trail, and no explanation for what had happened during that quiet night when his daughter disappeared. As time passed, the public attention surrounding the case gradually faded. News outlets moved on to other stories, and the Carter family mystery settled into the category of unsolved disappearances that linger quietly in official records. Yet for Michael Carter, the search never truly stopped. Every decision he made carried the same silent question that had followed him since that morning. Somewhere, he believed his daughter was still alive. Somewhere, the truth about her disappearance existed, waiting to be uncovered. What he could not have imagined during those long years of uncertainty was that the answer would eventually lead him back to the same house he had abandoned after Eleanor Carter's funeral. And when that moment arrived, the discovery waiting inside would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family's past. Nearly 8 years had passed since the day Eleanor Carter was buried, and the Carter house on Maple Ridge Road was locked for the final time. During those years, Michael Carter avoided returning to that place completely. The memories inside those walls felt too heavy, too closely tied to a chapter of his life he believed had already been closed. But time has a way of forcing people back toward the places they once tried to forget. The proposal from a development company finally gave Michael a reason to revisit the property. They wanted to purchase several houses along Maple Ridge Road to build a modern residential complex, and the Carter house stood directly in the middle of the land they needed. Signing the contract would be simple. One signature, and the house that held his childhood memories would disappear along with the past that lived inside it. Yet before agreeing to the sale, Michael felt an unexpected need to see the property one last time. It was not a business decision. It was something quieter, something tied to the unfinished feeling he carried since his mother's funeral and the disappearance of his daughter. On a cold autumn evening, Michael's car turned slowly onto the street where he had grown up. The neighborhood looked smaller than he remembered, though many of the same houses still stood along the road with only minor changes over the years. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the branches of old trees moved gently in the wind above the sidewalks. As he drove closer to the end of Maple Ridge Road, memories returned without warning. He recognized the driveway where he once practiced riding a bicycle, the yard where he and neighborhood friends played long summer games until sunset. Those familiar landmarks felt distant now, as if they belonged to a life that existed far earlier than the success he had built for himself. When his car finally slowed beside the Carter house, the quiet presence of the property made him pause before stepping out. The house looked almost exactly as he had left it years earlier. Time had changed small details. The white paint along the porch railing had faded, and vines climbed slowly across the wooden fence that bordered the yard. Tall grass covered most of the lawn, bending gently in the evening wind. Yet the structure itself still carried the same shape Michael remembered from childhood. The front windows reflected the dim streetlights, giving the house an appearance that was both familiar and strangely distant at the same time. For several seconds, Michael remained beside the car, looking at the place where his entire early life had unfolded. Selling the property would erase that connection forever, but he reminded himself that holding on to empty buildings would not bring the past back. Eventually, he walked toward the front porch, the gravel beneath his shoes crunching softly in the quiet street. Each step closer to the house seemed to pull more memories into his mind. The porch boards creaked under his weight just as they had when he was a boy running in and out of the front door. Michael reached into his coat pocket and removed the brass key he had kept since the day he locked the house after Eleanor Carter's funeral. The metal felt colder than he expected as he slid it into the lock. For a moment, the door refused to move, as though the mechanism had forgotten how to open after so many years of disuse. Then, with a slow turn of the handle, the door finally gave way. The air inside carried the quiet scent of dust and old wood. Michael stepped across the threshold and allowed his eyes to adjust to the dim interior light filtering through the curtains. The hallway looked almost exactly as it had the last time he stood there. Furniture remained in its original position, though a thin layer of dust covered every surface. A chair near the living room doorway had tipped slightly to one side, and one of the small tables along the wall appeared cracked along the corner. Aside from those small signs of neglect, the house seemed frozen in time. The silence inside felt deep and undisturbed, as though nothing had entered the building since the day Michael locked it. He walked a few steps farther into the hallway, glancing toward the staircase that led to the second floor. That was when he heard it. At first the sound was so faint that he questioned whether it had truly happened. A soft movement somewhere above him, followed by the unmistakable shift of weight on an old wooden floorboard. Michael stopped walking and listened carefully. The house returned to complete silence for several seconds. Then the sound came again, clearer this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving somewhere on the second floor of the house that was supposed to be completely empty. Michael's heartbeat quickened as he looked up toward the staircase, trying to understand how anyone could possibly be inside a place that had been abandoned for nearly 8 years. The quiet house seemed to hold its breath around him as the footsteps continued overhead, each one echoing softly through the old wooden structure. And in that moment, standing alone in the hallway of his childhood home, Michael Carter realized he was no longer certain that the house had truly been empty all those years. For several seconds, Michael Carter remained standing at the bottom of the staircase, listening carefully to the faint movement above him. The footsteps had stopped, leaving the house wrapped once again in that deep silence that had greeted him when he first stepped inside. His mind searched for simple explanations. Perhaps an animal had found its way through a broken window. Perhaps the structure itself was shifting after years of neglect. Yet something about the sound felt too deliberate, too measured to belong to anything accidental. Slowly, Michael placed his hand on the wooden railing and began walking toward the stairs. Each step upward carried a quiet creak that echoed through the hallway below. The air on the second floor felt colder than the rest of the house, and the faint smell of dust seemed stronger there, as though the rooms had been closed for even longer than the space downstairs. At the top of the staircase, Michael paused, looking down the familiar hallway where several bedroom doors stood slightly open. The arrangement had not changed since his childhood. The first room belonged to Eleanor Carter, the same room she used for decades before her reported death. Across the hallway was the guest room where relatives occasionally stayed during holidays. At the far end stood the smaller bedroom that Michael once used as a boy, its door half open just as he remembered leaving it years earlier. The silence pressed against him again, heavy and watchful. For a moment, he wondered if the sound he heard downstairs had simply been his imagination. Then another noise reached him from the direction of Eleanor's old bedroom. A soft shift, like someone stepping lightly across the floor. Michael moved slowly down the hallway until he reached the door. The wood looked worn but intact, the brass handle dull from years of use. His hand hesitated for a moment before turning the knob. The door opened with a long creak that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet house. What he saw next stopped him completely. Standing in the center of the hallway beyond the doorway was Eleanor Carter. She looked older than the last time he saw her, but there was no question about who she was. The same sharp features, the same calm expression that Michael remembered from his childhood. For several seconds he could not speak. Every memory of her funeral, every document confirming her death, collided with the reality standing only a few feet away. The woman he buried 8 years earlier was standing in front of him as though those years had never happened. Eleanor did not appear surprised to see him. Her posture remained steady, her eyes fixed calmly on her son as if she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. Michael struggled to form words, but before he could say anything, another movement caught his attention behind Eleanor. A small figure stepped out from the shadow of the doorway beside her. The girl moved forward slowly at first, then suddenly broke into a run the moment she recognized his face. "Dad." Emily Carter ran straight toward him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his waist before he had time to react. The shock of the moment left him frozen as he looked down at her. For 3 years he had imagined countless possibilities about where she might be, whether she was safe, whether he would ever see her again. Now she was standing right there, alive and holding on to him as though no time had passed at all. Michael knelt down, gripping her shoulders as he looked into her face, trying to understand how this moment could possibly be real. "Emily, where have you been?" His voice sounded unfamiliar even to himself, strained with disbelief. Emily looked up at him with the simple honesty of a child who believed she had done nothing wrong. For her, the reunion seemed joyful and natural, as though she had simply been waiting for him to return home. But the words she spoke next carried a quiet weight that sent a chill through Michael's chest. "Grandma said you would never come back." Michael slowly lifted his eyes from Emily and looked again toward Eleanor Carter, who remained standing calmly in the hallway. The silence between them felt heavier than the years that had passed since her funeral. In that moment, one truth became painfully clear to him. Whatever explanation existed for the disappearance of his daughter and the impossible return of his mother, it had been waiting inside this house the entire time. And Eleanor Carter had known it all along. The moment Michael Carter realized that both his mother and his daughter were standing inside the abandoned house on Maple Ridge Road, the quiet reunion quickly turned into a situation far beyond anything he could process alone. Within minutes, he stepped outside and contacted local authorities, struggling to explain a story that sounded impossible even as he spoke the words. Officers arrived soon after, followed by detectives who had once worked on the investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance years earlier. For them, seeing the missing girl walk out of the house alive was both a relief and a shock that reopened a case many believed would never reach a conclusion. Emily was carefully escorted outside and placed under the protection of medical personnel, while officers entered the property to begin documenting what had happened inside the house that had supposedly been abandoned for nearly a decade. As investigators moved through the rooms, they began to discover details that slowly revealed the truth behind the strange situation unfolding on Maple Ridge Road. While the house appeared empty from the outside, the interior told a different story. Several upstairs rooms showed signs of quiet activity that had been carefully hidden from view. One bedroom contained recently used blankets and food supplies stored in sealed containers. A small radio rested on a table near the window, along with notebooks filled with handwritten notes. Everything suggested that someone had been living inside the house for an extended period of time without attracting attention from neighbors or passing traffic. When detectives questioned Eleanor Carter directly, the explanation she offered began to reshape the entire investigation. According to the evidence later confirmed by investigators, Eleanor Carter had never died 8 years earlier. The illness reported as heart failure had been part of a carefully arranged deception. Through the help of her longtime attorney and a small number of individuals who believed they were simply assisting with legal arrangements, Eleanor managed to create the appearance of her own death. The sealed coffin that Michael watched lowered into the ground had never contained her body. Records connected to the funeral were arranged in such a way that no autopsy was performed and no official examination of the remains ever took place. After the ceremony ended, Eleanor quietly disappeared from public view while the town believed she had been buried in the local cemetery. The Carter house remained locked and silent on the outside, but Eleanor continued to use it as a hidden refuge where few people ever looked closely. Investigators soon discovered that Emily Carter's disappearance 3 years earlier had been directly connected to Eleanor's plan. According to Eleanor's own account, she had been watching Michael's life change rapidly as his wealth and influence grew across the country. In her mind, the world surrounding his success carried dangers that she believed he could no longer see clearly. She worried that Emily would grow up surrounded by people interested only in money and status, far removed from the simple values Eleanor believed were essential to a child's character. Over time, those concerns developed into a conviction that she alone could guide Emily's future properly. When the opportunity appeared during one of Michael's business trips, Eleanor arranged for Emily to be quietly taken from the house and brought to Maple Ridge Road under her care. For 3 years, Eleanor Carter lived inside the abandoned house with her granddaughter, carefully limiting contact with the outside world. She obtained food and basic supplies through discreet methods that investigators later traced to nearby stores and delivery services used under false names. Emily continued her education through books, lessons, and routines Eleanor created within the house itself. To the outside world, the property remained nothing more than an empty building slowly aging at the end of the street. Meanwhile, inside those quiet rooms, Eleanor believed she was protecting her granddaughter from a life shaped by wealth and influence. As detectives assembled the full timeline, the truth became both shocking and strangely calculated. Eleanor Carter had staged her own death, hidden herself within the house everyone assumed was abandoned, and secretly raised Emily Carter there for years. Her explanation remained consistent throughout questioning. She insisted that her actions were motivated by a belief that Michael's fortune had changed the world around him in ways that placed Emily at risk. In Eleanor's mind, removing Emily from that environment was an act of protection rather than harm. Yet for investigators reviewing the evidence, the reality was far more complicated. A woman declared dead for nearly a decade had secretly taken her own granddaughter and hidden within the same house where her life had supposedly ended. And now that truth was finally beginning to surface after years of silence. As investigators continued examining the Carter house on Maple Ridge Road, the story that Eleanor Carter had described during questioning began to shift in ways that raised even more troubling questions. At first, her explanation sounded like the reasoning of a grandmother who believed she was protecting her granddaughter from a world she no longer trusted. Yet the deeper detectives looked into the evidence inside the house, the more they realized that Eleanor's actions had not been the result of a sudden decision made out of concern. Instead, the documents scattered throughout the upstairs rooms suggested something far more deliberate. In a small wooden desk inside Eleanor's former bedroom, investigators discovered several journals carefully arranged beneath a stack of old accounting books. Each journal contained handwritten entries dating back many years before her reported death. Page after page revealed that Eleanor Carter had been documenting her thoughts, observations, and plans in a level of detail that left little doubt about how long she had been preparing for the events that eventually unfolded. Those entries painted a picture very different from the explanation she had initially offered. Long before Emily Carter disappeared, Eleanor had already begun writing about her concerns regarding Michael Carter's growing wealth and influence. She described watching her son's life transform as his companies expanded across the country, bringing him into contact with powerful investors and individuals she believed valued profit more than family. At first, her writings focused on criticism of the environment surrounding Michael's success, expressing worry that Emily might eventually grow up believing money was the most important measure of a person's worth. But as the journals progressed through the years, the tone of Eleanor's reflections began to change. The concerns she recorded slowly developed into a belief that the fortune Michael built should never have been separated from the values she believed she had instilled in him during childhood. In several entries, she referred to the Carter wealth as something that belonged to the family as a whole rather than to Michael alone. Investigators noticed that the timeline described in the journals matched key moments in the Carter family history with remarkable precision. Years before the reported heart failure that supposedly ended her life, Eleanor had written about the possibility of disappearing from public view. She described studying legal procedures surrounding death certificates, burial practices, and estate transfers in ways that suggested careful preparation rather than idle curiosity. Later entries revealed how she gradually arranged her personal affairs so that the circumstances of her death would raise as few questions as possible. When detectives compared those notes with the official records from 8 years earlier, the connection became impossible to ignore. Eleanor Carter had been thinking about staging her death long before the event actually occurred. Further examination of the journals revealed another important detail. Eleanor believed that removing herself from public life would allow her to act without interference from the outside world. She wrote about the Carter house on Maple Ridge Road as if it were the perfect place to disappear, a property that few people visited and that Michael would likely avoid because of the memories connected to it. In one entry written nearly a year before the funeral, Eleanor described the house as a place where she could continue observing events quietly while the world believed she was gone. The idea appeared repeatedly throughout the later pages, always framed as part of a larger plan that would eventually involve Emily. By the time detectives reached the final sections of the journals, the pattern had become unmistakably clear. Eleanor Carter had not simply reacted to Michael's lifestyle or his growing wealth. She had been planning for years to reshape the future of the Carter family according to her own beliefs. The decision to take Emily from her father was described not as a sudden act, but as the final step in a long series of preparations. Eleanor believed that by removing Emily from the world Michael had built, she could guide her granddaughter toward the kind of life she considered meaningful and disciplined. The fact that the rest of the world believed she was dead only made the plan easier to carry out. For nearly a decade, Eleanor Carter had lived quietly inside the very house where everyone believed her story had ended. To neighbors and former friends, the Carter property remained nothing more than an abandoned building slowly aging at the end of Maple Ridge Road. Yet inside those walls, Eleanor had been watching, writing, and shaping the course of events that eventually led to the night Michael Carter opened the door and discovered the truth. In many ways, she had been living like a ghost, moving through rooms filled with memories while the outside world accepted the simple explanation that her life had ended years earlier. What investigators now understood was that Eleanor Carter had never intended for the truth to remain hidden forever. She believed that one day Michael would return to the house. And when that moment finally arrived, she expected him to confront the future she had carefully planned for his daughter all along. In the days that followed the discovery inside the Carter house on Maple Ridge Road, the situation that had stunned investigators quickly moved into the hands of the legal system. Authorities placed Eleanor Carter under arrest after confirming the evidence connected to her staged death and the disappearance of Emily Carter 3 years earlier. For many people in the small Ohio town where the Carter family once lived, the news felt almost impossible to believe. A woman who had been mourned and buried years earlier was now at the center of one of the most unusual cases the community had ever witnessed. While detectives continued gathering documents and reviewing the journals discovered inside the house, Emily was taken to a medical facility where doctors confirmed that she was physically healthy. The reunion between father and daughter unfolded quietly, away from the cameras that had once followed every development of her disappearance. For Michael Carter, holding Emily again after 3 years of uncertainty felt like the end of a long and painful search. The court proceedings that followed focused on the actions Eleanor Carter had taken over the course of nearly a decade. Prosecutors presented evidence showing how she had staged her own death, arranged the funeral under carefully controlled circumstances, and later removed Emily from Michael's home without his knowledge. The journals found in the house became a central part of the case, offering a detailed record of Eleanor's thoughts and preparations. While her defense attempted to argue that she believed she was acting in her granddaughter's best interest, the law viewed the situation very differently. In the end, the court ordered that Emily Carter be returned fully to her father's care, while Eleanor faced the legal consequences of her actions. When Michael left the courthouse with Emily beside him, the relief of that moment carried a quiet weight that words could hardly capture. Yet, even as life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, the emotional impact of what had happened could not be resolved overnight. Emily had spent 3 years living inside the walls of the Carter house, guided by the beliefs and rules Eleanor had created for her. Adjusting to life outside that environment required patience, counseling, and time. Michael understood that rebuilding trust and stability for his daughter would take far longer than the investigation itself. The experience had reshaped both of their lives in ways that would remain long after the case faded from public attention. Looking back on everything that had happened, Michael often reflected on the complicated relationship he once shared with his mother. Eleanor Carter had raised him with discipline and determination, shaping the values that helped him build his success. Yet those same convictions had eventually driven her to make decisions that fractured their family in ways no one expected. Standing beside his daughter after the case finally ended, Michael realized that some wounds cannot be measured simply by legal outcomes or public explanations. Sometimes the deepest scars come from the people who once stood closest to us. Because in the end, the Carter family story served as a quiet reminder of something many people struggle to accept. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from the people we trust the most. Now that you've heard the full story of Michael Carter, Emily Carter, and the shocking truth behind Eleanor Carter's disappearance, one question still remains. What do you think really drove Eleanor Carter to make the choices she made? After years of watching her son build a powerful fortune and a life far removed from the quiet streets of Maple Ridge Road, did she truly believe she was protecting Emily Carter from a world she no longer trusted? Or was something deeper guiding her decisions during those years she spent hidden inside the Carter house? The evidence revealed a woman who planned carefully, who studied every step before she acted, and who believed strongly that the future of her family should follow the path she imagined. Yet for Michael Carter and his daughter Emily, the consequences of those choices will remain part of their lives for many years to come. Stories like this often leave us wondering how well we truly know the people closest to us. The Carter family once appeared ordinary to neighbors and friends, a mother raising her son in a quiet Ohio town before he went on to build extraordinary success. But hidden beneath those familiar memories were decisions that changed the course of several lives. So we want to hear your perspective. Did Eleanor Carter honestly believe she was protecting her granddaughter, or do you think her actions reveal a different motive entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story shocked you, wait until you hear what happened in our next case, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thank you.